Hey everybody, welcome to the Activision panel. Up there, of course, is Jim Charne and Garry Kitchen from Activision's East Coast Design Center, and of course David Crane, and my old friend Brad Fregger. I haven't seen you in 20 years. Hey Brad. So I'm Steve Cartwright. Welcome. Actually, we've been coming to this Classic Gaming Expo for so many years. We've transitioned from talking about the early days of video games to the early days of the Classic Gaming Expo. So I thought I'd try something a little bit different this time. I have a little presentation on how I personally got to meet some of these gentlemen in the front of the room. A long time ago, now that picture isn't me, although it probably could have been back then. People were lining up in the theaters to see a movie by a then relatively unknown director. People were also dancing to the soundtrack of a movie starring that TV actor from Welcome Back, Kotter. Another thing happened that year. I graduated from college. Now I had a degree in electronics. I think that was before computer science. But back then computer science meant typing out instructions in Fortran and handing those instructions to a typist who would then enter them into punch cards that were then taken to a big university to run through a mainframe. And you'd get the results back 48 hours later. But while I was in school, I earned my spending money by being a professional foosball player. We went to school in Phoenix, and between classes, it was 120 degrees in the daytime, and there was only three things to do: play pool, play pinball, or play foosball. And since I had played soccer in high school, I tended to gravitate toward the foosball tables. One of my partners on the foosball tables was a guy named David Crane. And after college, we both ended up working at a company in Sunnyvale called National Semiconductor. And in addition to playing foosball and designing integrated circuits, Dave was also a big tennis player. Now back in those days, before Michael Jordan, before Tiger Woods, these are the guys that were on the cereal boxes. These were the real sports stars of the day. Of course, there's McEnroe, Borg, and Connors. And Dave was such a big tennis player, he actually lived at an apartment complex in Sunnyvale that catered to tennis players. In fact, I think he had to play tennis to get an apartment there. Dave's tennis partner was a guy named Al Miller. Now, Al Miller worked at a little company in Sunnyvale called Atari. But Al had a little problem. He had an employee at Atari that was really pretty creative, really kind of wacky, but not very ethical. It turns out that the project Al was paying him to build, he wasn't doing the work. He was actually paying his buddy under the table to do the work for him. So Al said, well, that's not ethical, that's not right. So he got rid of the guy. And that created an opening at Atari, and Al hired his buddy, his tennis partner, Dave. About the same time, Atari was working on a secret project called the Atari 400 home computer. Probably the world's first home computer. And Al had another problem. Al was having all kinds of problem employees those days. He had another guy that was supposedly doing the operating system for the Atari 400 computer, and it turned out the guy flaked out on him, didn't deliver. Al thinks he was actually working for somebody else on the side while Atari was paying him. So Al and Dave got together and worked, I don't know how many weeks in a row without sleep, trying to get the Atari 400 computer ready to ship. And they found out that they worked so well together, they decided to quit Atari and start their own company. Also at that time, the Atari home video computer system was pretty popular. And they didn't quite know what they wanted to do with this new company, so they said, well, let's make some video games in the meantime. And that was Activision. About a year later, they said, this stuff has taken off, we need to hire some new people. And Dave said, well, I know a guy that I used to play foosball with back in college, let's hire him. And if we can't teach him to make video games, he'll be able to do our soldering for us. And they hired me, and 3 months later I did my first game. Now, as a side note, the guy that Al had to fire because he was kind of unreliable and unethical and paying his buddy under the table to do the work for him. And the guy that he was paying to do the work for him, kind of a twist of fate there. Oh, and that other guy that was supposedly working on the operating system for the Atari 400 computer that he flaked out on Al as well, the guy on the right. So if Al hadn't fired Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and hired his buddy Dave Crane, who then hired me, I wouldn't be here. I always find that kind of amusing. So, back then, well, they hired me. They'd all been doing video games for a couple of years, which made them like the most experienced video game designers in the world. But I was brand new to it. So I didn't have any great ideas, but I took a different approach. I said, Dave, you know, if you took that car and turned it into a plane, you'd have a whole new game. Or if you took this and turned it into that, you'd have a whole new game. And Dave thought that was kind of clever, and based on that kind of thinking, I got the job at Activision. For example, at the time there was a pretty popular game in the arcades called Defender. Everybody remember that one? I said, you know, if I took that spaceship and turned it into a submarine and put it against a blue background, I'd have a whole new game called Sequest. And the darn thing worked. People didn't actually realize it was nothing but Defender underwater. And one of the other Activision co-founders said, that's a pretty good idea. I'm going to take that spaceship and turn it into a helicopter and put it in the desert and call it Chopper Command. I think those were the first clones. Nowadays, of course, the whole industry is based on reimagining previous hits, and it actually works kind of pretty well. In fact, some of the biggest hits today are nothing but reimagined versions of games that came before them. In fact, and I like to show this to, sometimes I give a talk to younger people and they always find this interesting. Whatever you think is new has all been done before. Sorry, Justin. But there was one game that really did break new ground. In fact, this game introduced some concepts that had never been heard of before, in fact, are still used in virtually every game that's made today. That game, of course, done about 30 years ago, is Pitfall. And I think I have a TV commercial for Pitfall. Let me see if this thing works. Oops, I jumped ahead too far. I was going to surprise you that the precocious 12-year-old in the Pitfall TV commercial turned out to be Jack Black. Let me see if I can pull up that commercial.
Just last night, I was lost in the jungle with Pitfall Harry, surrounded by giant scorpions and man-eating crocodiles.
Well, Harry and I just grabbed the van, swung through the trees, and over the tar pits and found the jungle treasure. It was really neat.
If you haven't met Pitfall Harry, you're missing the year's most incredible video game adventure. Pitfall for the Atari 2600 and Intellivision.
Since I met Pitfall Harry, no other man will do.
Pitfall, designed by David Crane for Activision.
In fact, I've got another little video that kind of celebrates the 30 years since Pitfall was made.
In 1982, video games are taking over living rooms everywhere, and a three-year-old company named Activision is turning out one-hit game after another, with simple games like River Raid.
If you haven't met Pitfall Harry,
And Activision establishes dominance in a crowded field.
That's when our design team comes in. They're constantly pushing back the creative boundaries in game design.
designed by David Crane for
Pitfall
Activision.
was my 6th or 7th game at Activision, so I'd been doing games at Activision for quite a while. And the way we did video games is we get an idea and we do it.
Many of the games have just 1 or 2 programmers and must be finished within a few weeks, not months or years.
And the fun has just begun.
The ending of a video game project is really hard. There's always a deadline. You're always working at least 16 hours a day, usually all-nighters in the last week of the project. In fact, I pulled one project where for 6 weeks I worked 16 hours a day, and then for 2 weeks 20 hours a day, because I had a deadline.
With such a demanding schedule, how do the programmers relax between projects?
So when we're done, we would decompress a little bit. We'd sit around the lab, we'd play other people's games, we'd scribble on a piece of paper and figure out what we're going to do. Several times I had experimented with a little running man on the television screen.
David Crane just wanted to build a game around it because he was really, really fond of that little running man he'd made. There weren't very many games where you actually played as a human. You were always a spaceship or some kind of weird little creature.
Most of the characters are bleeps and bloops. Something in the shape of a tank, pixelated tank. We really hadn't been doing animated characters where you tried to actually have the thing that looked like a person. And I had a pretty darn good one, but I could never figure out a game to do with it. And so I'd move on to the next game, and I would do a complete game, and then I'm decompressing after the last one, and I said, you know, that little running man, I'd pull him out. And I kept pulling him out of the drawer and playing with him.
But it would take almost a year for the running man to finally have some place to run to.
Finally, I just flat out said, this is it. I'm going to use this little running man in a game. So on my blank sheet of paper, I drew a little running man, a little stick figure. Well, where is he running? So I drew a path for him to be running on. Where's the path? Jungle's a good place for a path. There's some trees. Why is he running? He's running after treasures and he's being chased by whatever. So in about 10 minutes, I had a piece of paper which represented the game Pitfall. After that was 1,000 hours sitting at the computer to make that happen. But it was 10 minutes for the idea.
With a setting, other elements quickly fall into place.
I found the way to the gold. Pitfall by Activision.
Including a few trend-setting gameplay styles.
It was revolutionary in a lot of senses, but I think more than anything, it was the first game to be a platformer. It was the first time you could control a character and jump over things and to swing on things.
There was humor, you know, with the little Tarzan yell. That's something you really didn't see in games before. You weren't used to seeing that kind of personality.
There were so many things to do. Jump, it was climb, it was avoid things. It was like a living, breathing universe. And the jungle aspect was, of course, the big theme of Pitfall. But no one had ever attempted anything like that before.
Pitfall introduces its own little treasure.
A big thrust of the game was you had to collect treasure.
Gold! Ah! Did I mention the tar pits?
And the idea was to get the highest score at the end of the level. And that has translated into so many games today, but that was the first time you really collected things.
An unsuspecting public is welcomed to the jungle in September of 1982. Critics and fans react with excitement to the high watermark that Pitfall has set.
It was really exciting when I got it. I saw it over at my cousin's house, and when our parents got it for us, we were just really happy. One thing I really noticed and remembered about the early Pitfall was just the graphics. A lot of the other Atari games at the time had pure black backgrounds or solid color on the background. This one had the trees that were drawn there. The crocodiles looked like crocodiles. Everything in the game looked like it was supposed to be. The Atari 2600 was very limited in what it could do, but it really pushed the envelope. I was a huge Pitfall fan. It came out, whatever it was, 6 months after the Indiana Jones film, and I was still a big, huge Indiana Jones fan, and this was like really the opportunity to live that adventure. And you know, no game before then really did anything quite like that. It was simple and kind of silly looking, just a little stick figure guy, but at the time, it went farther, I think, than any other game to really immerse you in an adventure.
Pitfall quickly sells millions of copies and becomes a must-play game. The success of the game ensures Harry will get another ticket to the jungle.
Okay, Steve, come on down.
And for those who don't know, I have to put in a plug that you'll notice it was September 1982. It's 30 years to the day, almost, for Pitfall, and Dave has just launched a Kickstarter campaign to go back to the jungle and he's going to build a new jungle game. And if you want to go see that campaign, it's jungleventure.com/kick, and be a part of it and help Dave create the next great jungle adventure. That was my plug.
I think I benefited from Pitfall also, because when people went to the store to buy Pitfall and they all sold out, that's when I had released my first game and they bought Barnstorming instead.
Going back to the early discussion about Nintendo, just following up on what Howard said, there was one other great translation mess besides The Boy and His Brob. I remember when the NES first came out, very early, first set of games that came out, first 10, 15 games, one of them, and someone in this audience will know, but it was one of the games that came over from Japan, developed by Japan. You played all the way through, you reached the end, and the last screen was my favorite line in the video game. It was, "You are win." And I just thought that was great that we didn't even bother any decent translation. Anybody know what game that was? It actually was in a released US game, "You Are Win," to this day. Was it Track and Field?
I don't remember. I think no, something like that.
Yeah, somebody's got to find that out. Get a copy of the screen for me. "You Are Win." So, we're talking about Activision. So why don't we start down there and let's just talk a little bit about what we all did and how we started. You got a mic that works down there, Brad?
I think so. Hello, Brad, is it working?
Yeah, there we go. Thank you. I actually joined Activision about 1980-81, but I was the director of training and development. I wasn't in the software side of it. And I actually didn't begin in the software side into the creating the video games and the computer games until after Atari crashed, and we started doing computer games because video games weren't selling anymore. So that's kind of when I got started, but and a lot of things changed at that time. Alan and David and Bob Whitehead all went someplace else. They went to their own little design center, and I was chosen to be their producer. Right, David? And but before that, we did the computer games, and Steve's being a little bit modest here because he did Hacker and Hacker 2, and those were two fantastically great games. But I think probably the earlier days prior to that, we need to talk to somebody else. So why don't we switch to somebody else right now? But if they want to know a lot about the computer days, come to my presentation tomorrow morning. Now there's my plug.
There you go.
My presentation tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, and I'll tell you what happened when we started with computer games.
So Steve, we just heard how he joined. I was East Coast based, Activision was West Coast based. Most of you guys may know this already. I had a small little independent group in New Jersey, including my brother Dan, a couple of other guys, John Van Ryzen, who ended up doing Hero. I reverse engineered the 2600 in New Jersey in probably 1980. And first game was a game called Space Jockey, 2 KB. Not my finest effort, but you know, you had to start somewhere. It was my model game to reverse engineer the platform. Then I did the home version of Donkey Kong for Coleco as an independent contractor, and then I approached Activision sometime early 1982 because Activision did the best games. The games were really good. I took pride in my work, and I wanted to work for the best company, so I called them, and I ended up joining Activision in June of '82. Right at that point, I guess Dave was deep in Pitfall at that point. I had just finished Donkey Kong, joined Activision in June of '82, brought my guys with me, and we opened Activision's first satellite design office called the Eastern Design Center, which were 5 of us. And we created a new position called a Creative Development Manager. And Activision West Coast advertised in the New York Times for the position, got a lot of inquiries, and we ended up hiring this guy, Jim Charne, as the Creative Development Manager of the Eastern Design Center in probably July, August 1982.
Yeah, I was living in Manhattan. Actually, my background is very different from my colleagues up here, and I'm very proud to call them my colleagues. In that I don't have a computer science background. You know, I'm not an engineer. I'm a lawyer, and I started in the record business. But I got very, very interested in computers and the use of computers for entertainment purposes. And I'm practicing law in Manhattan in a music business, sort of typical music business practice. Saw an ad in the New York Times from Activision and answered it. Got a response back from Activision maybe a week or two later, thanking me for my interest, but advising me they had many responses and they were way more qualified than I was, and that they wished me good luck and they'd hold on to my resume, but thanks, but no thanks. I didn't want to accept that because I thought this really sounded cool. So I wrote them a letter back and said, you know, with all due respect, your ad said you want this, here's what I've done. Your ad said you want that, here's what I've done. You know, if you choose to reconsider, I'm still very interested in the position. And then one thing led to another, and I was invited out to New Jersey to meet Garry and his group, who spent a day grilling me on various things. Then was sent to California, spent a day in California, really with David, Al Miller, Bob Whitehead, probably Steve, you were out there too, and the HR people, and eventually they made me an offer to manage the New Jersey Design Center and the Boston Design Center. We had a group up there as well. We're ex-Parker Brothers people who had joined Activision as a second remote design group. Now, I was responsible for both centers. I would not, you know, be bold enough to call myself a producer. Garry, the fellows in New Jersey, didn't need me, a lawyer, to tell them what should be in the game. But my role there really was to provide an environment that was conducive to letting them focus on what they all did best, which was to design and create games, and to kind of take all the distractions out of the mix so that I could take care of everything to give them an environment and a facility, really, and just a workplace that let them create free from distractions. And for me, it's a wonderful journey. I spent three years or so at Activision until the Atari business collapsed. I stepped out of the business for a few years, but then got back in when the first opportunity presented itself. When Garry hired me for the second time at Absolute Entertainment, and continued in the business really to this day. I mean, currently, I'm practicing law in Santa Monica, California, representing talent in the games business. That's my group.
Here's how important Jim Charne is. I always tell this story. A few years ago, I spoke at a conference, and it was all lawyers. It was intellectual property, talking about games, and I was invited to speak. And they asked for a bio, and I gave them my bio, my illustrious background in the game industry, and everything I'd done. And there's probably 500 lawyers in the audience. And Jim is also there. So they introduced me, and guy gets up on stage, and out of everything in my bio, he says, Garry has been in the game industry so long that he's the one who hired Jim Charne into the game industry. And the entire place could not believe it, because at this conference, Jim was far better known than I was. This is all lawyers. And they were amazed that there had been somebody who'd been in the game industry longer than Jim, who actually hired him into the game industry. And that was my claim to fame. That was great. It was great. So I'm proud to have hired Jim.
Now, what they were really impressed with was because in Jim's position in this industry, every video game contract ever written has some of his language in it.
Right.
That may sound like an exaggeration, but you know, he's been representing talent. He's been making deals. He's been closing deals for decades. So he was the star at that particular show. Now, for those of you who've been here before, you know that Steve, who just did his little video there, has always been self-deprecating about copying game ideas and that sort of thing. And on the one hand, it is true. That's why I hired him. We were trying to expand the game group, and we we had 4 people who worked together really well, and more important than what someone could do was whether they would destroy our group synergy and make a mess out of the lab. So the decision that we made was, we're going to hire somebody we get along with, not someone who comes in with a great pedigree. Steve had never written a line of assembly language code, although by some twist of fate, he had taught assembly language programming, but he'd never written a line of assembly language code. But he came to us and he said, you take that skiing game and you turn it upside down and you do this, and it becomes a whitewater river rafting game or whatever. And that may not sound like much, but it really told us that he was thinking about how to use 2600 hardware. You know it can do it because you saw it in a different game. But he actually left out my favorite copying story of Steve's career. He did a game called Mega Mania. And
one of my favorite games ever in the 2600, Mega Mania.
Absolutely applaud that, because it is one of the best playing games in history. But he had seen a game in the arcade called Astro Blaster. What was it? Astro something.
Astro Blaster. Games that sounded like that at the time.
Yeah, and they were very similar. And then he was just inspired by that and did Mega Mania. But if you look at any one of the games that he claims he copied, what we tried to do at Activision is we would polish a game until it was right. And you look at every game that Steve has done, the polish is there. Mega Mania was just perfect. You would reach just to that point where you're just about to die and you would complete a level, and it was all timed very well. So we have to give it up to Steve for having that skill, and that's what makes classic games. It's why people will say today that classic games are still fun to play. It's because of that kind of thing. But then one day, we were still trying to expand Activision, and a programmer came in to interview. And we looked at his resume, and he was the programmer behind the arcade game Astro Blaster. So we decided that Steve would be the guy who got the interview. And he even showed him Mega Mania, and the guy never batted an eye, never mentioned anything. It was just a complete letdown.
Well, he wanted the job.
Yes.
He wasn't going to say anything.
Or he may have recognized that Mega Mania was a better game.
Yeah.
But here's another example of how I reimagined something that had already been done. Dave did a game called Ghostbusters. Remember that? The original Ghostbusters. And you had this, the Ghostmobile that you equipped, and you traveled around the city fighting ghosts. And I said, that's an interesting mechanic. I'm going to change the Ghostmobile into a robot. I'm going to have the robot travel around the world in underground tunnels, and then the robot comes up and it does some kind of mission. And I forget what I called it, but it was kind of neat, but there was no theme to it. There was no commercial value to it. And Brad took a look at it and said, you know that movie called War Games, where a kid hacks into a computer system? Suppose you hack into the system to control this robot. We'll call it Hacker. I said, what's a hacker? Was this like 1983 or something? And so that's an example of what a great producer did back then. He took a relatively a cool game that had nowhere to go and turned it into a big hit.
Well, maybe I should. Maybe I should just fill a little bit more in on my journey with these gentlemen, colleagues. I like that idea, Jim. In 1983, I became the first producer of product game. Before that, they were project managers. I became the first producer, and I produced the product for the main design center. And then when Al and David and Bob split off, I produced for them. And then ultimately, I became the director of entertainment software, and I actually produced for Garry as well. So I was producing product for all of the entertainment product at the end for Activision. And what the guys would say about me, I'll never forget one of the quotes, it might have been Steve. The quote was, we never do what you say, but you always give us good ideas. So I guess that's the job of a producer. They don't necessarily do what you say, but they get good ideas from you.
So we've done this panel so many years, trying to figure out what are great stories that you haven't heard. Come on, Dave, come up with something new that we haven't had on this panel over the last 8 years.
Did you just say come up with something new from 30 years ago?
Yes, come up with something new from 30 years ago that we haven't already done on this panel. Or you can just repeat one of your favorite stories, if you can think of one of those.
How about something about Freeway?
Freeway, there's a great Freeway story. You know that. That's why you're prompting him. Where'd you get the idea for Freeway, Dave?
Well, the basic idea for Freeway came at a trade show. We were going to CES in Chicago and riding the bus to McCormick Place. And it's very complicated to park around there, but I saw some guy who was trying to save $5 in parking, so he parked on the wrong side of the road, climbed the chain link fence, ran across 10 lanes of traffic, climbed the chain link fence on the other side. You know, he saved $5, he risked his life. But I very clearly remember remarking to whoever was sitting next to me that said, you know, there's a great idea for a video game. And in fact, that was one of the games that I did instead of Pitfall. I came back from this trade show with this idea for Freeway and put Pitfall Harry on the shelf because I still hadn't figured out a good game for it. But the Freeway, you know, we always talk about how hard it is to design a game on the Atari 2600. Freeway was one of the biggest challenges. If you look at games way back to Atari Air-Sea Battle, you can see that by splitting the screen into horizontal bands, you could have multiple objects, not on the same line, but vertically repeated like that. What you'd never seen before is the other player object, the other tank object, being used twice across the screen, so in vertical bands. And in the middle of all of the nonsense you have to do to use that character a second time to make another car in another lane, you also had to be programming the two different chickens, which were in vertical bands. And I tried to do that for weeks. And I used to live close enough to the office, or the office was close enough to where I lived at that particular point, that I would walk to work. And I remember having this idea, walking back to work at 8:30 at night one night, fleshing out the idea as I was walking and making Freeway possible. And that is actually one of those times where I told Steve what I was doing. And even his jaw dropped at this point. It was a very complicated thing. And he said, not for the last time, but possibly the first time, he said something like, all those people out there playing these games, they don't have any idea how hard this stuff is. And it's absolutely true. I mean, we were just making it up as we went, but we had to come up with all sorts of interesting tricks.
And Freeway should be obvious to everybody based on that concept. Freeway was originally Little Man running up and down. And every game had a working title game before it had a real marketing title, and I believe the name of Freeway was Splat.
No, it was actually Squish.
Squish, sorry. And it was two little guys, but in the 11th hour, the marketing genius said...
The technical reason it was called Squish is because there were no subdirectories on computers back then. We were all sharing a mainframe, and all of our files were in one directory. One even a directory, it was on one hard disk. So the way we differentiated our files is we used an initial as the last letter of the file. So I had all these different files, and they ended in C, .asm or C.list or whatever. And so that game was called SQUISC. So that because what you could do is you could do a directory of all files that end in the letter C, and you get to see all your files. So yeah, it was a little running man vertically, which looked terrible. I mean, as some of you have seen it, I don't know, it looks like a roach. But we were trying to figure out exactly how to market it for our first trade show that game was going to go to. And at the time, there was a very popular character called San Diego Chicken, who used to appear at San Diego Charger games, and it was really very popular. Actually, he started out as a radio mascot for the radio station KGB, so he was the KGB Chicken, then he became the San Diego Chicken and became himself. And so Jim Levy said, if you make it a chicken crossing the road, we can play on that old joke, and I can hire the San Diego Chicken to come and run around the trade show and promote the game. So he called the San Diego Chicken, and the San Diego Chicken says, one day appearance, I can do that. That's going to be $5,000 for me, $2,000 for the chicken assistant, who we found out was his girlfriend. First class airfare both ways. And, you know, we're a small company, and this is ridiculous. We pay thousands of dollars for a chicken.
And Jim knew that Dave could wear the chicken suit just as easily and no one would know, so.
No, better than that, we had a PR guy in the company. This is honest truth. Our PR guy was named Fred Hypes, H-Y-P-E-S. And he just said, I'll wear the chicken suit. Unfortunately, what Fred was best known for is he couldn't go to lunch without getting food on his tie. So we had to pay an extra deposit on the chicken suit before we could take it with him. A couple other things about that game, since we're talking about it.
Wait, did I ever copy that game?
Lots of. Let me think.
All right, well, let's be fair. Well, there's always the question about Freeway and Frogger. They were both developed independently. Frogger was developed in Japan, miles away. You know, we were very secretive about the games we were developing, so there was no cross-pollination there. It just happened to be a coincidence. But Freeway is a copy of the game Space Race. Al Alcorn, the number 2 man at Atari, made Space Race an arcade game way back then. And it's a pretty cool little game. You got 2 spaceships and you're racing how many times can you get up to the top through the little white dots that were either called stars or asteroids. I can't remember what they called them. So Freeway was pretty much the same game, and I had played Space Race, so I had to pay homage to that game. But what I was about to say is, anybody in this room has ever hooked up a 2600 has probably pulled the cartridge out while the machine was powered on. In fact, sometimes you have to do that just to get it to run these days. One of the interesting things that you will sometimes find, you get all the neat little patterns on the screen, and sometimes you get random audio. Occasionally, if you pull a cartridge out, you will hear the Freeway horn honking, car horn. And that was one of my favorite things because, you know, car horns are often done with 2 horns, 2 pneumatic horns, at slightly different frequencies, and they have that blaring sound. And I nailed that one. I mean, that was a car horn.
Yeah.
You know, and it just happened the 2600 could do it really well.
What other games do you want to know about? Any specific ones?
My favorite one I have here, I was hoping to get autographed, but Dragster. I know it's one a lot of people have negative comments about. It's one of my favorites since I was a kid.
Probably the shortest video game in history. The 5-second video game.
Negative comments.
It's too hard, I don't get it.
It's too hard, I don't get it. Oh yeah, I blow my engine.
Yeah, it's like, you know,
bring it up right here, I'll break 6 seconds.
That's right.
All right, that has an interesting story because when we brought it to the trade show, we always brought pre-production copies, EEPROM copies, gave them to the sales managers and the district salespeople so that they could learn how to play them and they could get good at them. And our Chicago sales rep was this guy that, I mean, he looked mafia to me. He literally looked like Al Capone. And his adult son was also working in the group. And so he decided he'd be the one that learned how to play Dragster so that he could explain it. And the next day, he comes up to me, grabs me by the throat, and said, I ought to kill you. And I believed him. You know, this guy looked like a junior Al Capone. And what he was complaining about is he started playing Dragster, and 35 hours later stopped playing Dragster without sleep, without meals. And it's a 6-second game. How do you play a 6-second game for 35 hours? Well, try to shave that last 1/100th of a second off the time. And there was a lot of tweaking in that. I mean, to hit some of those scores, you've got to pop the clutch, rev the red line, pop the clutch, figure out how to, what do they call it, racing shift, where you don't use the clutch. Power shifting, you know, all of those things. I mean, you could just follow standard shifting, you know, shift it first and say go, and then when you can let it off, which is the clutch, and you can do all those things. But to get those scores, you had to learn all of those various techniques. And I mean, that's just one of my favorite things. It's a 6-second game that you can play for hours.
Does everybody know the story of the bug in decathlon? That's a great story. Dave, tell them about the bug.
I think everybody knows it.
Everyone knows it?
Did you ask? Is there anyone here?
Is there anyone who doesn't know it? I can't see with that. A lot of people don't know them. There's a great bug in decathlon.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's in every decathlon or if we revved the ROM. I really don't know the answer to this, and some collector can probably tell me. Yep, I got both. I did decathlon, and that was a major effort. I mean, that was all 10 events in one cartridge, and we were about to release the game. And one of the more touching stories of that era was the Make-A-Wish Foundation that grants wishes to terminally ill children. One of their recipients wanted to meet the game designers at Activision. So he was flown to the company, film crew accompanied, talked to all the game designers. He got to see the latest work, got into the back lab where nobody gets to go, you know. And one of the sessions was, the cameras were set up, he was playing the latest game, hadn't yet been released, hadn't even gone out to ROM yet. And it had just gone out to ROM, let's put it that way. And so, bright lights, camera, he's kind of distracted, and he's playing the pole vault. And he runs, wiggling the joystick braking running method to get the speed up in the pole vault. Then he pushes the button to plant the pole vault. And then the interviewer asks him a question, and he absentmindedly starts pushing the little red button on the Atari joystick. And I'm sitting there on camera with this kid, watching my game character go higher and higher and higher every time the button was just keeps going up. So I finished that interview as best I could. And I went to our guy in charge of manufacturing, and I said, "Stop the presses, get that ROM back."
Thank God for that little kid.
No, he said, "We can't." I think they made the first 50,000 of them. So anyway,
back then the way the games were made, you had to make a ROM mask. I think they cost about $250,000 to make. And so the thing was, we took such pride in the fact that the games were all bug-free. To actually have a bug in a game that would cost $250,000 to fix was a big discussion point.
So it's an unknown question as to whether or not there are collectible decathlon cartridges out there that if you continually push the red button, they'll just float off the top of the screen. It's possible. It existed. Don't know if it got into manufacturing or not.
I'd like to get that video to see what my expression was.
Hey Gary, you know what my favorite story is? Was when David says that he would fiddle around for breaks, but every once in a while we'd suggest to go to a movie. So one day I say, let's all go to a movie. You guys have been working hard enough. Let's go down and go to a movie. So we chose the movie called Ghostbusters. We went down, we were watching Ghostbusters. After the movie, we go to a pizza parlor. We're sitting there and David says, I'm going to do that movie. I'm going to do that movie. I'm going to do that movie. And so those people that say that a game will never sell unless you market it at the same time the movie comes out are crazy, because that movie didn't even get licensed until after it had been out.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah. Yeah, that was a great game. But you didn't start from scratch on it.
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, as I remember it, we went to see that movie because Tom Lopez, who was the vice president of product, had actually had discussions with the possibility of getting this license. But he was very careful, and rightly so. He didn't commit to getting that license. He basically came to us and said, can you guys do a great game around this movie, and can you do it in a timely fashion? Because you do have to release a game shortly after the movie comes out, or unless it's really a blockbuster hit, Ghostbusters may have qualified. You don't get any benefit from the movie's popularity. So I had been working on a game I was calling Car Wars, and it was a racing down the freeway with multiple cars on the screen, and It's kind of based on a Alan Dean Foster short story, I think, of the same name. And people equip their cars with machine guns and all this kind of stuff. And anyway, so I looked at that and I said, can I take what I've got here, which is half a game, half a project done, and somehow make a game that uses the licensed characters. It's hard to come up with a game that has something to do with a license. The best way to do that is to come up with a great game and just keep the license in mind as you're doing it, and pieces kind of flow into it. And so I had this in-game currency system where you would earn points and dollars, and you could buy equipment, and you could buy new machine guns for your car and all that. And I turned that into equipping the Ghostmobile with vacuum cleaners and ghost vacuums and whatever else. A little bit lame, but and then the second half of the game was completely written from scratch. So it was nice to have several months leg up so that we could actually get a game out in a particular time. And really the funniest thing about that, now that I think back, is I have a number of Parents' Choice Awards for my games because of the positive human values that they represent and all this. I was into shoot-'em-ups as much as anybody else, but every time I started to do a shoot-'em-up, something happened, and it turned into something else. So I never did a violent game. So it just happened that way.
Yeah, cars running over people, that's not bad.
I have a Ghostbusters story as well. At the time I was on the East Coast as the creative development manager. This was a very, very big game for Activision. In fact, it was one of, if not the first licensed product that Activision ever put out. And I took a trip to London with Ken Coleman, who at the time was the head of product development at Activision, because Tom had left to go into business for himself with Joel Bressler. And we're in London talking to the Activision people in Britain, and the game is coming out on the Commodore 64 in the US. In the US, most Commodore 64s that were sold with disk drives, which were very expensive. In Britain, the economy wasn't so great, and the standard for Commodore 64 owners in Britain was to use cassette drives to load programs, and the game would be sold on a cassette in Britain. One thing I discovered in Britain is that piracy was so rampant that the shelf life for a Commodore 64 cassette game, before it would be knocked off and would be sold as a bootleg by the tape copiers, was 1 week. So we really only had 1 week effectively to sell the Ghostbusters game in Britain before it was getting knocked off like left and right.
And my claim to fame on that Commodore 64 Ghostbusters game is Dave was so busy making the game that he called his friend in New Jersey and said, you know what I really want? On the title page, I love the song, and I want to have a bouncing ball to the music. So that's what I did. I wrote the bouncing ball on Ghostbusters Commodore 64 to help Dave out, because he was a little swamped at that point.
There was another issue with Ghostbusters. In Europe, Commodore was shipping bad ROMs to Europe. They were in trouble with the upper areas. I don't know the words. I was never a programmer, guys. I don't know any words about programmers. I was just a good producer. But anyhow, there was problems with that upper ROM, and David was using everything in that game, and so the games failed in England. They were going crazy. Vice President of Sales came in to me and he said, "You fix this, or you're going to get fired." And I told him, "You get the hell out of my office, or you're going to get fired." Anyhow, he came back and apologized. But the point is that we had to fix that upper. We had to do something. And I don't remember what we did, David. Do you remember what we did?
No clue.
No clue. Okay. We probably just let him go the way it was.
Well, another thing on that title page in Ghostbusters was the yelling of Ghostbusters. And the way we did it was, as Gary said, he and his crew came up with Follow the Bouncing Ball code and put all the lyrics in there. And then if you press the space bar, you would get the crowd yelling Ghostbusters from the movie. But when we tried to generate that audio, we couldn't get anything clean out of a capture from the film itself. It was background music or something, whenever there was the the Ghostbusters yell. So we just collected a whole bunch of people around the office, put them around the microphones and yell. And so that crowd was actually Activision employees at random yelling Ghostbusters.
And who remembers who wrote that song, the Ghostbusters song? Anybody remember? Yes, Huey Lewis is the right answer. Ray Parker Jr. stole it from Huey Lewis and lost in court.
He only stole the bass line.
But it was enough to lose in court. Are we almost out of time? What time do we end here? It's 4:07. Do we just keep going till someone throws us off the stage? Anybody want to throw out another game? Pressure cooker, quick pressure cooker. Everybody know the great pressure cooker music story? Who doesn't know the music story on pressure cooker? Great, enough people, I'll tell the music story. Real quick. I always hated that all the 2600 games, the music sounded like hell. It always sounded awful. This is completely awful. And I'm not a musician, I just knew it sounded like hell. So, but one day I said, why does it sound so bad? And if you went through the 2600 and all the possible tones that it would generate, the problem was most of them weren't notes in frequency. They weren't in tune notes. They were sour.
There's only 7 notes in the 12-note scale that could produce.
Right, and no one ever bothered to worry about that. Well, Jim was from the music industry, and he was in our office, so I got a Casio keyboard, and I figured out what notes we could use, and I marked the keyboard with black tape, only on certain keys. And Jim knew people in the music industry, so he went out and he got a professional jingle writer named Steve Gabori. And we brought Steve Gabori in, and we said, we need a song for a new video game. Here's the keyboard, only use the black keys. And he looked and he goes, what? I said, just play a song, only use the black keys. He goes, you kidding me? And I said, no, and it took him a little while, but he did it. And that's why that song sounds good, because there are no sour notes in it. And that was
I think that may be the first video game that has a musical score.
That's in tune.
It wasn't just sound effects or bips and boops, but was actually music that played throughout the game.
And where is Steve Gabori today? You know, I actually looked him up on the internet like a year ago. He's still writing music.
Yeah, he's still around. I think he's still in New York City.
And the reason I did Pressure Cooker was because I was, as Dave was watching somebody run across the street on Lakeshore Drive, I was standing at a Burger King. That's what video game programmers eat. And I looked past the guy at the register, and you could see a conveyor belt going by with the little burgers going under the flames. And I said, I could do a conveyor belt with hamburgers on it. And that was it. I did Pressure Cooker, because you can ask my family, that's all I ever ate was hamburgers back then.
And it was another one of those coincidences because Pressure Cooker and Burger Time on Intellivision came out about the same time.
Right, about the same time, yeah. And unfortunately, Pressure Cooker came out on the dusk side of the Atari industry, so it didn't do anywhere near the numbers that I had hoped it would do, but it did all right.
Well, the Atari 2600, though, again, I tell this story. You can ask the designers. Joe DeCure often speaks at conventions like this, and he was the assistant designer. He went on to design the Atari 400, 800 chipset, the Amiga chipset, a number of other things. He's now a fellow at IEEE. But the 2600 was only designed really for Tank or Pong. I mean, they made it cartridge programmable so that they could sell a Tank cartridge. And oh, by the way, they could sell a Pong cartridge separately. And every other game that was made was just serendipity. We figured out a way to use the hardware in a certain way. So the 2600 should have lasted about a year, and it had already lasted 10 years at the point Gary's talking about. And so for Pitfall 2, I expected some other machine to come along, but the NES had not yet hit America. So I said, all right, if the Atari 2600 is going to live, then let's give him a little facelift. And there's a custom chip inside Pitfall 2 that makes a lot more capability for the graphic kernels, and it has 3-part harmonic music. So the reason the Pitfall 2 score is harmonic is because I put circuitry inside the cartridge that made that possible.
And Steve Gabori thanks you for that. What else? Any questions? Q&A?
Yes. Do you guys have any other times when you guys were programming that your lives were put in danger, you feared for your life or anything like that?
Now, it wasn't me running across the traffic. He was asking if we ever had our lives put in danger while programming.
We almost killed ourselves on a couple of games, but no, I can't think of any.
Too much hamburgers and pizza.
Yeah, and M&M's.
Cardiac problems.
I remember one entire project. I think it was Stealth ATF, one of the early jet fighter games on the NES. The entire program, months we worked on it. I ate chocolate 10 grams. I think it was probably 6 months. I was only food I ate for 6 months. That almost killed me. But no, I can't think of anything else.
But probably the worst schedule we worked on was A Boy and His Blob.
Yeah, that was a good one.
You know, Absolute Entertainment, which I guess these three were also involved in Absolute as well as Activision. But Absolute was the first American licensed publisher for
actually developer.
Acclaim
was the first publisher. We were the first licensed developer.
And but then you turned from development to publishing.
Right.
And so A Boy and His Blob was the first product being published under this new license. And it had to be right, it had to be on time. But you know, you finish a game and now you say, all right, what am I doing next? And it was, if we could get this thing done in 6 weeks, this is a 7-month game development at least. If we could get this thing done in 6 weeks, we can, you know, really make a splash as a U.S. publisher.
It had to be done on May 30th, submitted to Nintendo on May 30th. And Dave flew out to New Jersey to Absolute's office, middle of April, and said, I got this cool demo, you want to see it? And we looked at it and said, think we can get this done by May 30th? We got it. So we brought a couple of programmers in, along with Dave and I. One guy in particular, brilliant, one of the most brilliant programmers I've ever met in my life, a guy named Rick Booth. This guy he was from another planet. And we walked through the concept. We were at about the 5.5 week mark now. Explained the whole thing. I'm going to work on it. Dave's going to work on it. We're going to roll up our sleeves. We're going to submit it May 30th. And we come out, and Rick, very quiet guy, comes over and he goes, can I ask you a question? And I said, yeah. He goes, is it normal to do a game like this in 5.5 weeks? And I said, no, not really.
No.
And then Dave was nice enough to stay in New Jersey at that point.
I moved to New Jersey from California for those 6 weeks. They got me what I called the flop house.
It was a little rental down the road from the office in a 100-year-old Victorian, little tiny room that was pretty sad.
But you talked about a project that almost killed you. We were doing at least 16 hours a day from the beginning, from the absolute beginning. And for the last week, we were doing 20 hours a day. And I know for 3 days, I was doing, you know, just, 20 hours on, 4 hours off. Didn't really matter what the hours were. It's just like, I gotta go sleep, and I'd sleep for 4 hours. And then an all-nighter right before. And that was the one where we sent somebody out to Nintendo, right?
Right. We were so tight on the May 30th deadline that we couldn't overnight a package to Nintendo in time for May 30th. So we flew an engineer out, and he stayed in a hotel across the street from Nintendo with a PC and a ROM burner that we shipped. And we modemed code to him at about 3 in the afternoon on May 30th. He burned the ROMs, and at 4:45, he walked into Nintendo and put it down and wanted to take Bill's desk. And we made the deadline. Great.
That story actually has a lot of other information about it. This was our first title ever for Nintendo. And they looked at us straight in the eye and they said, if this thing is not in by 5 p.m. on May 31st, you will not have a game for Christmas. You will not. We will not do it. We won't build it, whatever. But, and that was also the June CES. So after that all-nighter, after that horrible thing, we got on an airplane and we flew to Chicago. And we took along a development system just in case.
Just in case the bug, you know, it's possible there's an odd bug we missed. So we had a development system with us, and the next day we're going to stand up at CES, Dave and I, show the game off to 1 million people.
So we started doing some play testing and found a bug, and then another bug, and then 15 bucks, 30 bucks, 100 bucks.
So we had the computer set up in one of our bedrooms, and we had a tester laying on the bed. And this was the night before CES. And he'd go like this, and I had written some code in the game, and David had written some code in the game. Dave wrote most of the code, I wrote a little bit. So he'd find the bug, and he'd go, Dave, I think that's your bug. So Dave would drag himself up and go sit at the computer, fix the bug. We'd burn a new ROM, give it to the tester. Gary, found the bug on blah blah blah. I think that's your bug. This went on the entire night. We must have fixed 100 bugs between 7 o'clock in the evening and 8 the next morning when we said, we got to go to the booth. So with no sleep and the latest ROM, we went and stood at CES the entire day and showed the game off. And God help us when you think about what the code was that we sent to Nintendo.
Oh, we thought the tester had been playing this game, you know? We couldn't watch him do it, we were too busy, but... And then it even gets worse, because it turns out that that game was extremely popular inside Nintendo. The people who were evaluating these ROMs, these games, you know, you had to pass a certain score, or they wouldn't put out the game. You know, they were very heavy-handed on controlling the quality of the game. And you know, they identified this one to their friends in the company, and it worked its way up through the corporate levels. Everybody at Nintendo was playing A Boy and His Blob, which seems like it's a good thing, right? Well, remember that May 31st deadline that we killed ourselves for? On September, maybe 23rd, I get a phone call from Howard Phillips.
Howard of all people.
Yeah. At Nintendo, and says, you know, we really like this game of Boy and His Blob, but we want to change. I want you to make a change. I said, it's September. You know, it's September 23rd, whatever. And he said, yeah, but you know, if you can make this change and get it back to me within 24 hours, we can still make our deadline. And so, what it was is there was a flavor of jelly bean that's actually in some of the manuals that doesn't exist in the game, and I don't remember which one it was, but the problem was, in A Boy and His Blob, there are situations that you can create where you lose your blob forever. Game over. I mean, you cannot do anything, because if you don't have the blob, you can't play the game. So, like, you've thrown him off a cliff, and then gone out to a different place, and then when you whistle him to come back as a hummingbird, he goes the wrong way, and he's lost forever, whatever it is. And I knew that was the case, and I said, well, don't do that. I mean, no, that's a dumb thing to do. They decided it was a bug. I would call it a feature. So anyway, I took whatever that flavor was.
You ended up creating the ketchup.
I created the ketchup jelly bean.
So you could always bring the blob back by throwing the ketchup jelly bean.
And he wouldn't eat the ketchup jelly bean because I didn't have anything for him to transform into. So I actually had to write code that made him not like the jelly bean, the ketchup jelly bean. He would frown at you and not eat it if you threw it at him. But wherever you threw it and it landed, the blob would teleport to that spot from wherever he's lost in the maze. So I have been asked, there's some other flavor, but I don't remember what it was and what it's. So there's a transformation in there for that other flavor that's in the game.
Yeah.
But it's not hooked up. And I mean, imagine my surprise that on September 23rd.
Yeah, we're waiting for the boxes to come into the warehouse. Howard's calling up asking for changes.
They tell us we haven't submitted it yet, and you need to make this change if you want to make Christmas. Months after the deadline that they told us was a hard and fixed deadline.
Yeah.
So they can bend the rules for their own reasons.
Well, then we learned. We learned there were different rules. Any other questions? Go ahead. The old Venetian blind.
The question is the Venetian blind story. Now, there are some collectors here who have an EEPROM of the Venetian blind display. What that is it's a little window with a Venetian blind, and you push a button or whatever, and the Venetian blind folds up very neatly. It's really a nice little thing, and it shows this little landscape out there with the sunset happening. It's not a game, it's just this little thing. Well, when we started Activision, we were sued by Atari. No surprise, we had a budget item for paying for the Atari lawsuits. We knew they were going to try to sue us out of business. But of course, in a lawsuit, you have to say what it is you're claiming is contention. And one of the things that they mentioned was the Venetian blind technique. Now that was a slang term. The Venetian blind technique was when we would try to get more things on the screen, we would move the objects around and only show their even or their odd lines, and so they look like comb.
Like chess, right?
It looks like looking at something through a Venetian blind. Like chess could not have been done without the Venetian blind technique. So they were claiming that as a proprietary method, the Venetian blind technique. So
to make fun of them.
Contrary that I might have been, I did this whole thing. It took me, 3 or 4 days to make this Venetian blind display, and I sent it to my lawyers, and I said, send it to them and ask them if that's what they mean by the Venetian blind technique. And the funny thing about it is that the trade shows, I told you we were very secretive about what games we were doing, but by this time, Magic is out there doing games, and there are other competitors. And we showed the Venetian blind technique to the Magic programmers. These were guys we had worked with. And I realized at the time that was the first time that the Activision sunset, which showed up in many of Steve's games and many of, my games.
Keystone Capers.
Yeah, the Activision sunset, which was kind of a trademark way to have a blue sky with colors, that was the first time it was shown in public, and we kind of like sneak previewed it to our competitors by showing them the Venetian blind technique, although they never picked up on it.
Yeah.
We could go on for days.
What else we got? Go ahead.
Speaking of trademark signatures in games, one of the things I always noticed at that time when you released games back in the Atari era, there was always the Activision logo in the lower left-hand corner of the game. There was always like a signature thing with all Activision games. Was there a reason behind that? If you guys felt you needed to put that in every game, or was it a marketing technique, or?
There are some good stories around the logo.
I mean, that was Bob Whitehead. There's a when you're writing a 2600 game, the CPU is actually doing the display. It's horrible what it has to go through just to put that stuff up on the screen. And then there's a period of time after the screen where you can squeeze in some calculations, but it's really hard to fit certain calculations in there. You have to put in only so many, and you can't overrun, or your screen flickers or rolls. So Bob just one day, he said, I'm going to take this technique that we have for doing 48 bits of bitmap, and he put an Activision logo, and it was just a simple little white Activision, similar to our logo, not all that fancy. And we thought it was pretty cool, so every one of our games started going out with that. And we changed our logo a little bit, and we changed it to the flying A, so we changed that logo. But if you remember, the Activision logo with the flying A had this beautiful little rainbow behind it, and we didn't have that. So over in the East Coast,
the new upstart guy, I said, you know what? I'm going to add the rainbow to the logo. So I went into that kernel and I added an object, the wide object, and I wrote color and I made a beautiful rainbow logo. But it wasn't great. It was okay. It was pretty good. And I sent it to Dave. And Dave, I barely knew Dave at that point. I mean, I was scared to death of Dave at that point. Dave was the man, and I was this guy in New Jersey. So I didn't hear anything, but Dave took it, and Dave fixed it. He took what I had done and he slanted it so it butt right up against the A beautifully. And then he squared off the left side of it. So he refined, extremely refined, my first attempt. And then that new logo with beautiful following rainbow ended up going in all the rest of the games. So that was a little evolution. There was a damn guy in New Jersey trying to show off, and then the West Coast guys fixed it for me.
But it's like a lot of things. We just did it because it was fun. But it did kind of make for a consistent look. It's kind of nice. I was in Jim Levy's office once, and he had all of the Atari cartridges up on a shelf. And he was just sitting there looking at them, and I said, "What are you looking at?" He said, "Look at that product line." I said, "Like a Superman has this logo, and this one is like that." He said, "There's absolutely no consistency to their designs." And so from that day on, every Activision game, if you line it up on your shelf, everything lines up. Everything, it's got a very consistent line look, and that was something that Jim Levy was It was important to him. When Jim left Activision, he went into the radio business, which was really his first love. He grew up wanting to own a radio station. And so very quickly he was owning a radio station, then 3, then 7, then 19. And he had created an empire of just local radio stations. And I think he has divested himself of all that and moved to Napa. And he's actually blogging for the Napa town right now. He's just kind of hanging around doing stuff. That's where Jim Levy is today.
Anything else?
Yeah, how about the famous Actiplac issue on the labeling? What do you guys think about that? I have a particular story about a friend of mine who used to be a collector, and he had the Plaque Attack game with the Actiplac on it. The nickname given to the blue drying off and leaving marks on the label with time.
I don't know this. You know this? Plaque Attack? Your game? You don't know this?
The Actiplac was a nickname given to the fact that the glue would dry off and leave marks on the labels in the Activision games on the 2600.
Really?
You never heard of that?
No.
It blotches through.
Actiplac. Yeah.
Actiplac.
Okay. No, you've stumped us on that one. We're completely lost on that one.
You know,
what panel is this?
It probably illustrates to you that when everybody involved in these games made them, we expected them to last about a year. We really didn't expect it to last 30 years.
My favorite part of the 2600 was that certain cartridges I could turn over the bottom and squish the thing down because there were springs, and other cartridges I couldn't. That always amazed me.
Well, when we designed our plastic for this thing, we were going to be sued by Atari. And we also had a concern that they could theoretically go to the added expense of retooling their unit so that every Atari 2600 made after a certain point might make Activision games not work. And they would do it if they could. So they had a very fancy door latching mechanism on both on the console and then a mating thing on the cartridge, that it would open the thing and it would slide back and it would do all these kind of things. And the truth is, all you really had to have was, 2 pencils to poke in this hole and open up the port to the edge connector, PC port edge connector. So I was very much involved in this design, and we initially just put these little pointy things that would push in because it's hollow behind there, so they could push all the way in and all the way down. And I said, look, if I were at Atari and I were trying to screw over this young upstart Activision, I would retool that plastic so it's not hollow back there, because they could do it. And so the Activision game would get partway in and stop, and it would never mate with the system. So we went to the added expense of making each one of those little things retract with a spring, which is spring loaded. We protected our edge connector with a piece of foam. So if you look at the early games, they have the foam and then they have the 2 little prongs, and those prongs are engineered to have spring loaded, cost extra money, cost extra assembly and all that, just so that Atari could not do something to their console to make it so that our games don't work. They would have to invalidate their own games, for ours to stop working as well.
All right, one more good story. Only if you guys don't know this story. Who doesn't know the story about the A companies? About the A's. It's a good story. This is a true story, too. So, there was this company named Atari, which some of these people worked at. Not me. I never worked. People always think I worked at Atari. I never worked at Atari. Mr. Wojda worked at Atari. Steve Wojda down here, another industry veteran. So anyway, there was this company named Atari, and these upstart guys left to start Activision. And one of them had the idea, true or not, but this is the legend, that it was a great name to call them Activision because in the CES guidebook, when you looked up the companies that were exhibiting, Activision would come before Atari alphabetically. So it was great. Let's call it Activision, and then we'll be above Atari in the book. So then, I don't know, it was a little while longer, Al Miller left with Steve Cartwright, and they started a company called Accolade. Isn't that really strange? And then Garry Kitchen leaves.
Before that.
Oh no, then
Rob.
Then Greg Fishback. Greg Fishback leaves, starts this company called Acclaim to do NES games. And right after he left, I left and started a company called Absolute Entertainment. And that's a true story. But I think it stopped with Absolute.
Yeah, Aardvark was next.
Aardvark was next, or AAA software. We never did any of those.
About Aardvark.
Right. Apple Computer.
Does anybody know what the first name of Activision was before Activision?
I know.
It was in my slideshow, but I didn't mention it.
Yeah. You know, when you incorporate, you have to come up with a name, and you haven't gone through all the brainstorming to figure out a name. You know, naming something is one of the hardest things you can do. It was nice to have the A thing to fall back on. It made it a little easier to figure out what the name was. But anyway, we actually incorporated under the name V-Sync Inc.
It's so catchy. Why didn't you keep it?
V-Sync is the vertical sync signal that was part of every Atari. And they said, well, pick a name, just any name. We just have to get started. Then we changed the name later, and so we were incorporated under V-Sync Inc.
You know, before we wrap up, I just have to, one more plug. You can throw tomatoes at me. We talked about Dave's Kickstarter campaign, but I didn't mention one thing. You know, with Kickstarter campaigns, you contribute and you get cool stuff. And there's all sorts of cool stuff you get to work with Dave on this Kickstarter campaign. But why don't you, there is something special for CGE people only, right? And I'm going to give it to you since it's your campaign.
I have a microphone.
You don't need my microphone?
I don't need it.
Okay, go ahead, go.
Want me to do it with two microphones?
Yes, please.
Twice.
Stereo.
Yeah, when I decided to announce the Kickstarter project, I wanted to do it at CGE. I think, you know, the guys have supported me all these years, and I've tried to support them back, and it was really a great relationship. And so I just wanted to have something special that, you know, people at CGE who back the project get a collectible poster. We had a couple posters made, and at any level of backing, you get your choice of one of the two posters, one of which will never be used again. I mean, it is intended to be just here for CGE. And if you back at the $100 tier or above, you get your choice of both. And this is limited time offer. I mean, when the show closes on Sunday, it's the last chance to do it. So if you have any interest in having that collectible, back the game at even the minimum level, $15.
And signed by you, right?
I sat down there and signed them till I had writer's cramp. And you know, absolutely, it's just something we wanted to do for the show.
And if you catch Dave at the table, he will personalize one and sign it for you.
Yeah, that's for the 5,000 and above. Told you.
He's lying.
Well, for 5,000, you'll fly to their house for the last 6 weeks of development.
That's it. All right, anything else? Are we wrapping up here?
Can I do one plug for tomorrow morning?
Please, do it.
Tomorrow morning, if you want to hear a great story about converting Pitfall 2 to the Commodore 64 and the Atari 800, come and see my talk tomorrow morning. There's a terrific story around that.
What time is that?
I think it's 10 o'clock. Yeah, first thing tomorrow morning.
Beautiful. Thanks so much, guys. Thanks for coming.